Thank you, Courtney. She works tirelessly to coordinate and set this all up, so big thanks to Courtney. And thank you, everyone, for allowing me to present this topic to you today. My name is Irfan Fauq. I'm a psychiatrist here at Sierra Tucson for about the last year and a half. Today, I get the opportunity to talk about something that's been a long-standing interest of mine. One that I think on face value is a concept that most can get behind, and that is psychotherapy is beneficial. Not only beneficial, but downright awesome. But the question is why or how? What are the reasons of how psychotherapy works? What's the proof? And perhaps it's my own kind of neurotic leanings which drove me to explore this. Now, having gone through medical school and subsequent training, I've had a chance to be exposed to a lot of different perspectives about the relationship between mind and body. Granted, a lot of my past experiences in this domain have been driven by the idea that if change is occurring in the body, whether through disease, modification, or growth, there are things happening in the biological machinery of our makeup. And more to the point of this presentation, it's through that process and knowledge that I can hang my hat on building my beliefs and admiration of the impact that psychotherapy has. The outcomes of psychotherapy have traditionally been measured by assessing changes in symptoms and improvement in functioning. However, today I seek to present what psychotherapy can do on a biological level. And personally, this allows me to really appreciate its benefit. All right, so now related to my experiences on the professional side of the psychiatric world, obviously psychiatry has had an intimate relationship with how medication can impact the pathology of mental illness. And to that end, I'm sure most psychiatrists would agree that psychotherapy is beneficial. But it's becoming increasingly rare that a psychiatrist will engage in psychotherapy beyond what would be considered a supportive perspective. Now, whether that's through interest or lack thereof, whether that's through pressures of our current healthcare delivery model, or even by just not being exposed or to different types of psychotherapeutic modalities, it seems like there's this separation that's been established where psychiatrists affect change through medications and counselors and therapists affect change through psychotherapy. And in a way, while we know that the mind and body are inseparable, our practice doesn't necessarily reflect that. And for me, approaching the person and reminding myself of this intimacy between mind and body, I often try to negotiate how I can kind of meld psychotherapy and or medication together, trying to integrate that into a treatment strategy instead of kind of approaching it from a single-sided way that we often see in the outpatient setting. And frankly, it's a big reason why I enjoy working here, since I'm allowed to approach those that I see here with this in mind. So what's on the agenda today? So we're going to briefly talk about what psychotherapy is, and then we're going to move on to a review of the science, speaking about genes, the products of genes, neurons, and just a quick comment about the brain. And then we'll move on to the relationship between the brain and the environment, investigating what the literature has for lower life forms and us. Then we'll move on to the effects of psychotherapy on the brain, and then we'll end with a comment about medication therapy and psychotherapy, comparing and contrasting. So psychotherapy can help people learn how to challenge thoughts that are getting in their way. They can help learn skills to manage symptoms, improve relationships, and it's a vessel that can provide support, validation, and other interventions to help those that are experiencing a decline in their ability to live on their own terms. Psychotherapy can, in the best of cases, work to restructure how our subjective experience influences the brain. And it focuses on recognizing and changing thought patterns and beliefs that are creating or perpetuating suffering and dysfunction. Now, there's this bi-directional relationship between how our brain affects our experience and how our experiences affect the brain. We know through animal studies, human studies, and imaging that there's this clear interplay between the brain and the environment. An example of that experience, of how experience affects the brain, is through the process of learning. When we learn something new, the connections between neurons in the brain are strengthened and multiplied. And it's our brain's ability to change, repair itself, and adapt in response to our experiences that is driven through a process of change called neuroplasticity. We know that the brain goes through various processes of change in organization as we progress from childhood into adulthood. However, these changes don't become static as we age further. In fact, through the principle of learning, we can consciously influence the process and direct what connections are strengthened and reinforced or even weakened. And if we know life experiences like trauma and learning can alter brain structure and brain chemistry, what about the experiences of therapy? And I'll attempt to argue that the process of learning about oneself that occurs in psychotherapy can in itself influence the structure and function of the brain in a biologically tangible way. Now, a review of the science. So my intention is not to have this presentation kind of devolve and get lost in scientific jargon. That's not really the scope of what we're trying to do. But I think to have a broad understanding of certain principles helps us grasp and appreciate the generalities that are being presented today. So genes and gene expression. So we have a copy of all of our genes in every single cell that we have in our body, right? And we have a sequence of specific molecules in those genes. And the sequence serves as a template through which a process called transcription, which is here, and translation ultimately makes proteins. And this process is directed by a number of different factors, including environmental factors. The environmental influence can go as far as turning on and turning off the cell's ability to transcribe and translate certain genes, which ultimately what we're doing is to make proteins, which then those proteins go on to influence the organization, and the structure of neurons and greater brain structures. Move on to the next. So neurons, they're a major type of cell in our central nervous system. And in the brain, they communicate with each other. They relay messages through the body, and they power our thoughts and actions. Neurons can communicate with each other through a combination of electrical impulses and chemical molecules. And the space which two neurons communicate is called a synapse. And as you can see in the picture here, the message is traveling from this neuron to this neuron, and it travels down the axon, and it reaches a point called the synapse. And the synapse is the space between two neurons. And this is where chemical molecules are kind of cross this space, and that's how the signal is propagated. And so the more synapses that we have between neurons or groups of neurons, the easier it is for that message to be communicated or relayed. Now, a brief comment about the brain. So here you see kind of two pictures of the brain. On the left, you see what the brain kind of traditionally looks like. And then on the right side is basically they split the brain in half, and then they showed you kind of the inside. And so the distinction, for the sake of simplicity, the distinction I would like you to make is to the distinction is to separate the brain into two parts, between cortical structures, and that's kind of the surface structures, and what are called subcortical structures, or deeper structures of the brain. Now, the cortical structures are associated with the cognitive machinery of the brain, while subcortical structures are associated with the emotional machinery of the brain. And what we find is that there is this kind of modulation that goes both ways, where cortical structures, the cognitive machinery, can modulate the emotional machinery, the subcortical structures, and vice versa. And it's this interplay between the two that creates our psychological experience. Now, through advancement in research, we're building the body of knowledge that psychotherapy has specific measurable effects on the brain and body. In fact, a study that I found really interesting, it came from the early 90s, Bailey and his research group, they demonstrated how in ceaseless, that synaptic connections in their neurons doubled and tripled as a result of learning from the environment. And it showed that these connections can be altered or strengthened through gene expression connected with that learning from the environment. And so they postulated that the idea of learning from the environment is possibly the way that psychotherapy psychotherapy can create changes in the brain. What about mice? The humble mouse. So it occurs in mammals as well. A study by Greenup shed light on the mouse's brain's ability to change in response to the environment. So mice raised in a social environment that involved complex learning for survival had a greater number of synapses or connections per neuron compared to mice raised in isolation. So put another way, it's through this process of increasing connections in the brain that learning is effective. And so if psychotherapy is a type of learning, then this process may produce alterations in gene expression that create proteins that go on to impact the strength of these synaptic connections. What about monkeys? So it also happens in rhesus monkeys, where it was shown how the environment, in this case, the presence and absence of maternal nurturing, can influence the infant monkeys' genetic vulnerability to stress reactions. So basically, they took infant monkeys from this colony, and they were identified by how they reacted when separated from their mothers. And they measured their stress reaction via hormones and their depressive response. And so those infants in this colony, those with a higher stress response had a vulnerability to environmental stressors. And that was determined by these researchers to be largely genetic. So then they matched these infant monkeys with this high stress response to what they called unusually nurturant mothers. So these mothers that were very nurturing, caring, protective with their own offspring, and they matched those mothers with these high stress infant monkeys. And what they found is that when they were placed with these infants, the inborn vulnerability to separation anxiety actually disappeared. And furthermore, these infants also went on to rise to be the top of their colony's social hierarchy. And it was explained in the study that that these kind of super mothers helped the younger monkeys develop an innate sensitivity to social cues and respond to them in a way that was advantageous despite their genetic vulnerability to stress. So in humans, it was shown that it also happens in humans, where the environment can influence our genes and our genes can influence how we relate to the environment. Kendler and his research group, they showed that genetic factors can influence the sensitivity of individuals developing major depression after being exposed to stressful life events. This study looked at the probability of developing major depression in the absence or presence of a severe stressor when genetic factors were considered. So basically, they separated, they found those that with the lowest genetic risk, in the absence of a severe stressor, had a 0.5% probability of developing major depression. And those with the highest genetic risk, in the absence of a severe stressor, had a 1.1% probability of developing a major depression. Those with the lowest genetic risk in the presence of a severe stressor had a 6.2% chance, and those with the highest genetic risk in the presence of a severe stressor had a 14.2% probability of developing major depression. And what they concluded was that while we can have a genetic predisposition for mood disorders, it's the environment that was the most powerful risk factor for an episode of major depression. Now, it's been argued that traumatic experiences, trauma, can induce changes in the brain. Early childhood trauma, such as neglect and deprivation, can alter the subcortical, think emotional machinery, these areas of the brain that can influence the duration of alarm reactions or stress reactions, which manifest as emotional and physiologic reactivity. This can then delay the development of cortical structures, remember, cortical cognitive machinery of the brain, which can then limit the modulation of the said subcortical structures. And so there's this body of evidence that shows traumatic experiences during unstable periods of brain development can produce a regression to an earlier form of neural function in the brain. There are studies that show adults with PTSD, with a history of childhood and sexual abuse, have reduced volumes of certain brain structures associated with memory and emotional experience. And these structures were actually smaller and less developed compared to matched adults without this history. Even something like chronic peer victimization or bullying. During adolescence, there's a study that came out in the last few years. It showed that brain structures of teens that experienced bullying for an extended period of time made them more susceptible to developing anxiety-like responses and behaviors to stressful situations. Other fields of research are kind of focusing on this idea that environmental influence on genetic expression is actually more weighted during certain windows of time compared to other times in one's life. And these windows are primarily in early life, like early childhood, late childhood, puberty, mid-adolescence. And so it's really no wonder that there's so many psychotherapeutic modalities that stress the exploration of experiences during these periods. So ultimately, what I'm trying to show is that our environment can drive the development of neuronal connections. And, it's this impact that creates cognitive schemes for mental representation that we often try to use in psychotherapy. And it's these neuronal connections in areas of the brain that are associated with emotional experiencing, survival, planning, memory, and that they become linked since we know that the brain makes connections stronger the more frequent good or bad experiences occur. And it really underlines the idea that cells that fire together, ultimately wire together. A quick comment about imaging. It's really the advancement of imaging that has provided a lot of insight about what's happening to our brain as it develops, responds, and reacts to what we go through on a day-to-day, but also what the effect of psychotherapy has. Specific types of imaging like positron emission tomography, PET scans, or single photon emission computed tomography, SPECT scans, or even functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs. They allow us to see this process by evaluating changes in blood flow, electrical activity, and changes in brain structure on a macro level. And so literally, more so than any other time, we can see what's happening in the brain as an effect from therapeutic interventions. So there's evidence that has led researchers to speculate that psychotherapy and medication treatment and psychiatric disorders, they share common areas in the brain, areas of action in the brain, actually. And it is this impact that leads to psychological recovery. One would suppose that, if common areas of impact are acted upon, perhaps the underlying mechanism of neurobiological recovery may also be similar. So I guess if you take all the studies together, just as kind of a summarizing statement, what they find is that they suggest that, depending on what type of psychotherapeutic modality you use, whether it's cognitive behavior therapy, whether it's dialectical behavior therapy, short or long-term psychodynamic psychotherapy, or even interpersonal psychotherapy, they create functional changes in the brain in those that suffer from major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and borderline personality disorder. Now, many of these different types of therapies, they attempt to enhance a person's ability to problem solve, to improve the way that they consider their own self-concept, and to manage and regulate specific stressful emotional states. And to that end, we see that the areas that are impacted by these therapies are the ones that are specifically associated in managing those processes. This page kind of shows what CBT's impact is on the brain. There's actually a large section of the literature that addresses CBT's influence on changes in the brain, more so than any other type of psychotherapy. And it kind of speaks about how it translates to structural change and overall improvement in functioning. CBT has been shown to have long-standing benefit, and patients are half as likely to relapse after ending treatment. I would guess that CBT is probably has such a large market share of the literature because it can be manualized, it can be delivered in a consistent manner, and it can be used for a defined amount of time compared to other psychotherapies. Also because it's an often utilized form of psychotherapy as well. And so instead of going through each one of these, these results show that CBT creates similar changes in certain disorders on the brain compared to those seen with traditional medication treatment, specifically for generalized anxiety, OCD, panic, and social phobias. CBT's effect in depression was a little bit more varied, which suggested that instead of common areas of focus between medication and psychotherapy, there are actually complementary areas that were influenced in compared to medication treatment. So this principle that CBT, its effect on the brain was actually echoed in other therapies as well, particularly with interpersonal psychotherapy, which is a modality that directs its focus on social functioning, how the individual associates with their environment, as a way to treat various mood disorders, life transitions, grief, and interpersonal conflict. There are also studies, if you look at the bottom, that show that DBT and psychodynamic psychotherapy target similar areas in the brain associated with hyperarousal, threat recognition, and the development or consideration of one's self-concept. So to observe that psychotherapy may make changes in the brain doesn't, I hope I'm not trying to say, it doesn't imply that medication is no longer needed as an intervention, or that psychotherapy can really alter all biological substrates. With increasing advances in research, we're developing a more sophisticated approach in targeting psychopathology with medication intervention and others with like psychotherapeutic interventions. And the decision is usually based on the severity of the disorder and recognition of what specific symptoms that we're trying to address, ultimately to improve psychosocial functioning on the tail end. Regarding the treatment of major depression, according to the literature, there's this really great study from 2016. It was a meta-analysis that sought to determine how psychotherapeutic modalities and psychotropic interventions differed in their effect on the brain. So after, I think, churning the data of 18 studies of patients that underwent psychotherapy and 30 studies of patients that were prescribed SSRI as a type of antidepressant, it was found that psychotherapy generally impacted areas of the brain associated with higher level cognitive processes, think cortical areas, right, the cognitive machinery of the brain, such as memory encoding, retrieval, planning, and processing self-relevant information. And medication treatments were found to have the most impact on the subcortical parts, the emotional machinery of the brain, related to emotional processing, the perception of reward behavior, and also the visceral and autonomic processing of the body's internal function, and which is related to sometimes we see somatic complaints or somatic issues that are often related to mood issues. And so that's what medication can help with. This was underscored in another study where it postulated that the effectiveness of CBT, in particular for major depression, was through improved prefrontal function, which is just another a part of the brain that's part of that cognitive machinery. And that's involved in cognitive impressions, assessments, and while antidepressants, in comparison, actually work more directly on these subcortical structures that were involved in the formation of negative emotions. So, put another way, for the treatment of depression, psychotherapy, and medication therapy, they address complementary parts of the brain that are affected by the disease. The existence of complementary neural areas between the impact of medication treatment and psychotherapy could account for the enhancing effect that psychotherapy has on pharmacological therapy. And so, this combined approach can provide a more complete, enduring, and therapeutic response compared to medication therapy by itself, particularly with severe cases. And so there's this general pattern based off of the imaging studies that in some disorders like OCD, phobias, anxiety, similar effects between psychotherapy and medication treatment are observed. However, in depression, these modalities differed in their location effect, and it suggested different but complementary pathways to improvement. So, in conclusion, perhaps psychotherapy can be conceptualized as a type of learning, and that's how changes in brain chemistry and function occur. As a therapeutic relationship is forged, the individual is learning skills to change their behaviors, manage emotions, and overall just think differently. And it implies that psychotherapy is a little bit more than just a chance to chat or vent with a supportive person with listening skills. In understanding the biological mechanism, it may aid the improvement of such therapeutic interventions and provide a tool for therapeutic effects and go on to help clinicians select optimal treatment. It's this plasticity of the architecture of the brain that is driven on a molecular basis by gene expression, which changes related to normal development and environmental influence. And accordingly, the changes in the brain function caused by psychiatric disorders are assumed to be related to alterations in the expression of several genes in several brain areas. So the added perspective of specific effects of psychotherapy from a gene level to a structural level strengthens the credibility of something that up until the last few decades was a traditional and patient-centered approach to psychotherapy. In future, I think as the sensitivity of neuroimaging improves and a more refined understanding of how psychotherapy works, like mechanistically, this can go on to be used to create a more targeted and a specific approach in psychotherapeutic delivery. Yeah, I think that's it. Let's see. These are my references for this presentation, and I would welcome any questions. One thing that I know that a lot of people ask is, like, essentially, how is it that psychotherapy works? Is it, we know that these brain changes occur on a macro level, but what's happening on a molecular level? Especially since we know what happens with like medication treatment, we can actually see the changes that are happening. And a lot of studies, this is kind of a newer kind of field of research, and a lot of studies do suggest that psychotherapy can create similar changes on a molecular level as well compared to medication treatment. And that goes as far as turning on and turning off certain genes that will go on to make proteins. There are things called neurotrophic factors in the brain. One of them is called a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is a protein that has been shown to correlate with decreased levels correlate with increased symptoms of mood disorders, and increased BDNF correlates with decreased symptoms, and psychotherapy has been shown to modulate that. Also, psychotherapy has been shown to modulate the stress response on a molecular level, looking at glucocorticoids and the receptors that are involved. But this is kind of an evolving field, and I felt like it was a little bit outside the scope. It would really kind of get bogged down in scientific lingo, and it kind of takes away from the general point. So I just wanted to make that comment. So let's see. Okay, so one question is, can the structural changes, brain changes caused by trauma during childhood be repaired and strengthened as an adult using psychotherapy or medication? So it's an interesting question. There is evidence that brain changes can occur, particularly with the size of certain structures. That has been shown to change and go towards what would be considered a normal size. That is also something of a hot topic and something that's been debated a lot. Often when you look at the size of something in the brain, we have to also consider the density of neurons that are in there. So whether there's a size, there may be a difference in size between two brains, but this traumatized brain and not. However, looking at the density of the neurons is like that one step forward, which can actually tell you, does the size actually matter in the brain? What I presented was more of a general principle, and I think logically it makes sense that you do get this correction However, the mechanism of that correction is still something of a newer kind of scientific investigation. And so one other question is, please explain the brain pictures slide. So I'm not, let's see, is it this one? So this is just an example of like, these are two fMRIs. So this is just an example of how they determine what are the differences between these brains of people that suffer from psychiatric illness. So what they usually do is they take a pre-treatment image, and then they go through the intervention, whatever psychotherapeutic modality it is, and then they take a post-treatment. And so because they control for all the variables, the variable that is contingent of any changes between the brains is the psychotherapeutic modality. And so if they see any differences, they credit it as an effect of the psychotherapy. So that's it. But these pictures are just more of a general kind of principle, a comment. These are some pictures that show a comment about the advancement of imaging. And those are all the questions that I have. So thank you so much, for your attention. It's a privilege to be able to do this. So